The bystander effect. The bystander effect is a psychological phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to offer help to a person in distress when other people are present. The presence of others creates a kind of social paralysis, diffusing the sense of personal responsibility and diminishing the likelihood that any one person will intervene. This counterintuitive behavior was first brought to widespread attention after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City, where initial reports claimed that dozens of people witnessed the attack but failed to help. While later investigations revealed that the details were more complex, the event sparked intense interest in understanding why people sometimes fail to act in emergencies. At the heart of the bystander effect is the psychological diffusion of responsibility. When a person is alone and sees someone in need, they feel solely responsible for responding. But when others are present, that sense of responsibility becomes shared, or rather, diluted. Each person assumes that someone else will step in, and as a result, no one does. This effect becomes more pronounced as the number of bystanders increases, which is why help is often less likely in larger crowds than in smaller groups or individual settings. Another contributing factor is social influence. In ambiguous situations, people tend to look to others to determine how to react. If no one else is visibly concerned or taking action, individuals may interpret the situation as non-urgent, even if their instincts suggest otherwise. This hesitation is magnified by fear of judgment. People worry about overreacting or embarrassing themselves, especially if it turns out their help wasn't needed. In effect, the behavior of the crowd becomes a silent signal that everything is fine, even when it's not. The bystander effect is not a reflection of cruelty or indifference but of social and cognitive processes that can override our instinct to help. In many cases, individuals want to intervene but feel unsure or frozen, waiting for cues from others. Interestingly, studies have shown that when people are aware of the bystander effect, they are more likely to overcome it. Awareness can shift the internal question from, "Why doesn't someone do something?" to, "Why don't I do something?" Understanding the bystander effect is essential for cultivating empathy and responsibility in group settings. It reminds us that in moments of crisis, the assumption that someone else will help can be a dangerous illusion. Often, the difference between action and inaction comes down to one person deciding that they will not wait for permission from the crowd to do what is right. Projection. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism in which individuals attribute their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or motives to someone else. Rooted in psychoanalytic theory and first explored in depth by Sigmund Freud, projection serves as a way for the mind to protect itself from internal conflict and anxiety by externalizing emotions that are difficult to accept. Rather than acknowledging a disturbing impulse or uncomfortable emotion within themselves, a person unconsciously displaces it onto others, perceiving it as something that originates outside of them. For example, someone who harbors hostile or aggressive feelings they find unacceptable may begin to see others as being hostile toward them. In this way, the person avoids having to consciously recognize and deal with their own aggression. This mechanism is not deliberate or manipulative, it typically happens outside of conscious awareness. Projection allows people to maintain a more favorable self-image by keeping troubling parts of the psyche at arm's length, disguising inner turmoil as something caused by the external world. Projection can play out in subtle and complex ways in daily life. A person struggling with jealousy may accuse their partner of being jealous or unfaithful, despite no clear evidence. Someone insecure about their competence may view others as overly critical or competitive. This process distorts reality, not only masking the projector's true feelings but also often damaging relationships and fostering misunderstanding. The person onto whom the feeling is projected may become confused, defensive, or even manipulated into questioning their own behavior. The mechanism of projection reveals how profoundly self-perception influences how one interprets the actions and intentions of others. Since acknowledging certain emotions may threaten one's identity or self-worth, the mind redirects the discomfort by seeing it in the outside world. Projection often thrives in situations of stress, conflict, or emotional vulnerability, when the psychological need to protect the ego becomes most intense. In its more extreme or pathological forms, projection can contribute to paranoia, chronic blame shifting, and interpersonal dysfunction. In milder or everyday forms, however, it is a common human tendency. Almost everyone projects to some degree, especially in moments of heightened emotion. Recognizing one's own projections can be difficult but is an essential step in self-awareness and personal growth. Through introspection, therapy, or honest dialogue, individuals can begin to see when their reactions are more about their internal landscape than the actions of others. Ultimately, projection underscores the complexity of the human mind and the many ways it seeks to preserve a coherent sense of self. While it can temporarily shield us from pain or guilt, it often distorts relationships and delays emotional insight. Becoming more conscious of projection can lead to greater emotional clarity, empathy, and accountability, allowing us to take ownership of our inner experience rather than misplacing it onto the world around us. Emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the capacity to recognize, understand, manage, and effectively use emotions, both one's own and those of others, in various aspects of life. Unlike traditional notions of intelligence, which focus on logical reasoning, memory, or academic skills, emotional intelligence centers on the deeply human ability to navigate the emotional landscape that underpins relationships, decision-making, and personal well-being. The concept gained widespread recognition through the work of psychologist Daniel Goleman, who helped frame it as a crucial determinant of success not just in social settings, but in professional and personal domains as well. At the core of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, the ability to perceive and make sense of one's emotions as they arise. This involves being attuned to subtle shifts in mood, recognizing the emotional currents that influence thoughts and behaviors, and understanding how those emotions connect to values, fears, desires, or past experiences. With self-awareness comes the ability to regulate emotions rather than being controlled by them. Emotionally intelligent individuals don't suppress their feelings, but they can pause, reflect, and choose how to respond rather than reacting impulsively. This emotional regulation is vital in moments of stress, conflict, or uncertainty, where clarity and composure can make a significant difference. Another important dimension of emotional intelligence is empathy, the ability to perceive and relate to the emotions of others. Empathy is more than just feeling sympathy, it is the capacity to step into someone else's emotional experience, to sense their perspective without necessarily agreeing with it. This empathetic attunement is the foundation of healthy relationships, allowing for deeper communication, trust, and mutual understanding. People with high emotional intelligence tend to be better listeners and more effective communicators because they are responsive not only to words but to tone, body language, and emotional context. Emotional intelligence also involves social skill, the ability to navigate interpersonal dynamics with sensitivity and effectiveness. Whether in a team, a family, or a broader community, emotionally intelligent people can manage conflict, offer constructive feedback, inspire cooperation, and adapt to social situations with grace. They understand how emotions influence group dynamics and are skilled at building rapport, resolving tension, and fostering positive environments. One of the most powerful aspects of emotional intelligence is its impact on decision-making. Emotions are not barriers to rational thinking, they are information-rich signals that, when interpreted wisely, guide better judgments. Emotionally intelligent individuals use their feelings as data, recognizing when gut reactions offer insight and when they may be clouded by bias. This capacity allows for more thoughtful choices, resilience in the face of challenges, and the ability to balance emotional and cognitive inputs in complex situations. Emotional intelligence is not a fixed trait, it can be developed over time through practice, reflection, and a willingness to engage with one's inner world and interpersonal relationships. In this way, it is not only a set of skills but a form of maturity, rooted in compassion, self-respect, and the recognition that emotions are not weaknesses to overcome but essential guides in the human experience. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a foundational concept in behavioral psychology that explains how behaviors are learned and maintained through their consequences. Originally developed by B.F. Skinner in the mid-20th century, this theory moves beyond the reflexive responses of classical conditioning and focuses instead on voluntary actions, the things people and animals do intentionally to interact with and influence their environment. At the core of operant conditioning is the idea that behavior is shaped by what follows it. If a behavior leads to a desirable outcome, it becomes more likely to occur again in the future. Conversely, if a behavior results in an unpleasant or negative outcome, it becomes less likely to be repeated. In this way, operant conditioning works through a system of reinforcements and punishments that strengthen or weaken behaviors based on their consequences. Unlike in classical conditioning, where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a reflexive response, operant conditioning focuses on how organisms learn from the results of their actions and adjust their behavior accordingly. Skinner demonstrated these principles through experiments using what became known as the Skinner box, an apparatus that allowed animals such as rats or pigeons to interact with levers or buttons that would produce outcomes like food, light, or mild shocks. Through this setup, he observed that animals quickly learned to perform actions that brought rewards and to avoid those that led to discomfort. These findings provided a systematic way to study how motivation, choice, and behavior change over time. One of the most influential insights of operant conditioning is that reinforcement is not just about rewarding behavior, but about creating predictable patterns of learning. The timing and frequency of consequences, known as reinforcement schedules, play a major role in how quickly and how strongly a behavior is learned. For instance, behaviors reinforced every time they occur are learned quickly but may extinguish rapidly if the reward stops. On the other hand, behaviors reinforced only occasionally tend to be more persistent, even in the absence of consistent rewards. This principle underlies many real-life scenarios, such as why people continue to play slot machines despite frequent losses. The unpredictable reward keeps the behavior going. Operant conditioning has had a wide-ranging impact beyond laboratory settings. It is used in classrooms to shape student behavior through praise, feedback, and consequences. It forms the basis for many parenting strategies, such as timeouts or reward charts. In workplaces, incentive systems and performance bonuses operate on the same principles. Even in therapy, especially behavioral and cognitive behavioral approaches, operant conditioning is used to help individuals unlearn maladaptive behaviors and replace them with healthier alternatives. Importantly, Operant conditioning also raises ethical and philosophical questions about free will, autonomy, and control. If behavior is shaped by consequences, then how much of our daily choices are freely made, and how much are reactions to our environment? Skinner himself was a determinist, believing that human behavior could be explained and modified entirely through reinforcement principles, without appealing to inner mental states. While later psychologists have integrated cognitive and emotional factors into the understanding of learning, the basic principles of operant conditioning remain central to how we think about behavior change. In essence, operant conditioning reveals that learning is not just about passive absorption or reaction, but about active engagement with the environment. We behave in ways that we believe will bring us rewards or help us avoid discomfort, and over time, these patterns of behavior become habits, routines, or even elements of our identity. Whether we are training a pet, motivating a student, or changing our own habits, operant conditioning offers a powerful lens through which to understand and influence behavior. The placebo effect. The placebo effect is a psychological and physiological phenomenon in which a person experiences a real improvement in their symptoms after receiving a treatment that has no active therapeutic ingredients. This effect reveals the profound influence that belief, expectation, and perception can have on the body and mind. What makes the placebo effect remarkable is that the improvement is not imagined or faked. It can produce measurable changes in health, including reductions in pain, anxiety, and even symptoms of disease. The term placebo typically refers to a substance or procedure that has no specific medical action on the condition being treated, such as a sugar pill, saline injection, or sham surgery. Yet, when patients believe that the treatment they are receiving is genuine and effective, their brain and body can respond as if the treatment were real. This response is driven largely by psychological mechanisms, particularly the power of expectation. When someone expects to feel better, that expectation alone can trigger the brain to release chemicals such as endorphins or dopamine, which are associated with pain relief, mood enhancement, and healing processes. The placebo effect highlights the deep interconnection between the mind and the body. For example, a patient who believes they are receiving a powerful painkiller may report reduced pain and even show neurological patterns consistent with real pain relief, despite having taken an inert substance. These effects are not limited to subjective experiences like pain or mood. They have been observed in physiological measures such as heart rate, blood pressure, and even immune response. Importantly, the placebo effect is not deception in the traditional sense. Patients aren't simply fooled into feeling better, rather, the body responds to the belief in treatment as though it were medicine. The context in which treatment is given, the confidence of the doctor, the rituals surrounding medication, the appearance of the pill, can all enhance the effect. In this way, healing is not just about the chemical content of a drug, but also about the meaning the patient assigns to the treatment. Research has even shown that the placebo effect can occur with full awareness. In some studies, patients who were told they were receiving a placebo still experienced improvements, suggesting that the ritual of care and the symbolic value of treatment itself can activate beneficial responses in the brain. The placebo effect also poses complex ethical questions in medicine. While it underscores the importance of empathy, trust, and doctor-patient communication, it also challenges the idea that healing must always come from active pharmacological intervention. It reminds us that the mind's role in recovery is not secondary, but central, capable of producing real outcomes through expectation, hope, and belief. Ultimately, the placebo effect is not just a quirk of medicine, it is a window into the extraordinary capacity of the brain to influence the body. It reveals how perception can shape biology and how the experience of healing is as much about meaning and belief as it is about molecules and mechanics. The false memory effect. The false memory effect is a psychological phenomenon in which a person recalls something that did not actually happen or remembers it differently from the way it truly occurred. This distortion of memory is not the result of lying or deliberate fabrication, but rather a byproduct of how memory works, an inherently reconstructive and sometimes fallible process. Unlike a photograph or a video recording, human memory is not a perfect archive of experiences. It is dynamic, subject to suggestion, and highly influenced by emotions, expectations, and external cues. The roots of false memories lie in the way the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves information. Each time we remember something, we are not retrieving a static file but rather reassembling fragments of sensory details, emotional impressions, and contextual knowledge. This act of reconstruction opens the door to errors, especially when details are unclear or when our minds attempt to fill in the blanks. Over time, these reconstructions can drift further from reality, and repeated recall can solidify the altered version, making it feel even more vivid and convincing. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most influential researchers in this area, demonstrated how easily false memories can be implanted. In her studies, participants were exposed to misleading information after witnessing an event, such as being told that a car crash involved broken glass when it did not. Many later recalled seeing broken glass, illustrating how suggestion can reshape memory. In another famous experiment, subjects were told fabricated stories from their childhood, such as being lost in a shopping mall. Even though these events never happened, a significant number of participants came to believe and elaborate on them, constructing detailed and emotionally rich accounts of entirely false experiences. This susceptibility to memory distortion has profound implications, particularly in areas like eyewitness testimony, therapy, and the legal system. A person may testify with complete sincerity about something they believe they saw, yet their memory may have been altered by stress, leading questions, or post-event information. In therapeutic settings, especially when suggestive techniques are used, clients may come to recover memories of events that never occurred, believing with absolute conviction that they are real. The false memory effect also reveals how deeply memory is entwined with identity. Our sense of self is built upon the stories we remember and tell about our lives. When those memories are flawed or fabricated, it not only changes how we understand the past but can also influence our present emotions, beliefs, and decisions. A false memory of trauma, for instance, can lead to real emotional distress, even if the event never occurred. What makes false memories particularly striking is that they are often accompanied by a high level of confidence. People generally cannot tell the difference between a real and a false memory unless objective evidence contradicts it. This makes them psychologically powerful and potentially dangerous, especially when others, such as authority figures or trusted sources, unknowingly reinforce them. Despite these vulnerabilities, the study of false memories also highlights the remarkable flexibility of the human mind. Memory's reconstructive nature allows us to adapt, imagine, and integrate new perspectives, making it a tool not only for recall but for interpretation and meaning-making. However, this same flexibility also means that memory is never purely objective. It is shaped by our emotions, beliefs, and the narratives we create about ourselves and the world. In essence, the false memory effect reminds us that what we remember is not always what actually happened. Memory is not just a record of experience but a living, changing mental construction, one that serves our psychological needs as much as it reflects reality. Social identity theory. Social identity theory is a psychological framework developed by Henri Tajfel and John Turner in the 1970s that explains how people's sense of self is deeply intertwined with the social groups to which they belong. At its heart, the theory suggests that individuals do not derive their identity solely from personal traits or individual achievements, but also from their membership in social groups such as nationality, religion, profession, gender, or even sports teams. These group affiliations provide a sense of belonging, meaning, and self-worth. According to social identity theory, people categorize themselves and others into groups, us versus them, a process known as social categorization. Once individuals identify with a particular group, they tend to adopt the norms, values, and behaviors associated with that group. This identification becomes part of their self-concept, influencing how they see themselves and how they interact with others. The stronger the attachment to a group, the more that group's successes and failures feel personal, shaping pride, loyalty, or shame depending on the group's status or performance. A key aspect of the theory is the tendency for individuals to favor their own group, known as the in-group, while sometimes viewing out-groups with suspicion, hostility, or contempt. This in-group bias arises not necessarily out of hatred for others, but from a natural drive to enhance self-esteem by seeing one's own group in a positive light. When individuals compare their in-group to an out-group, they are often motivated to perceive their group as superior in order to reinforce a positive self-image. This dynamic can lead to stereotyping, discrimination, and intergroup conflict, even in cases where the group divisions are arbitrary or meaningless. Tajfel famously demonstrated this through his minimal group experiments, where participants were randomly assigned to groups based on trivial criteria like a coin toss or preference for a painting. Despite the lack of real significance behind the groupings, participants quickly began to show favoritism toward their own group and allocate resources in a biased way. This suggested that the mere act of identifying with a group, no matter how insignificant, was enough to trigger in-group preference and out-group bias. Social identity theory has profound implications for understanding human behavior in society. It helps explain the psychology behind nationalism, racism, sectarianism, and workplace dynamics, as well as how people find community and solidarity in shared identities. The theory also offers insight into how intergroup conflict can arise and persist, even in the absence of material competition, and why individuals may act in defense of a group even when they gain no direct personal benefit. Importantly, social identity theory also highlights the fluidity of identity. People belong to many different groups simultaneously, and their dominant social identity can shift depending on context. For example, someone may emphasize their national identity during a sporting event, their professional identity at work, and their family identity at home. These shifting identifications can either bridge or deepen divides between groups, depending on how inclusive or exclusive they become. In summary, social identity theory reveals that human identity is not purely individual but is fundamentally social. Our connections to groups shape our self-concept, influence our attitudes and behaviors toward others, and help explain both the strength of community bonds and the roots of social conflict. By understanding the mechanisms of social identity, we gain powerful insight into how people define themselves and relate to the world around them. Psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is a motivational response that arises when people perceive their freedom to choose or act as being threatened or restricted. First introduced by psychologist Jack Brem in the 1960s, this concept explains why individuals often resist persuasion, rules, or control, especially when those pressures are seen as infringing on their autonomy. Reactance isn't just about disliking rules or instructions, it is a deeply emotional and psychological impulse to reclaim one's sense of freedom. When a person senses that their ability to make decisions is being limited, they may experience an internal state of tension, frustration, or anger. This feeling is the reactance itself, and it often motivates them to restore the lost or threatened freedom. For example, if someone is told they can no longer have or do something they previously considered available, like being told they can't wear a certain outfit, listen to certain music, or voice a certain opinion, they may suddenly want that exact thing even more, not necessarily because of its inherent value, but because of the desire to assert their independence. The mere act of restriction enhances the appeal of the forbidden option. Reactance is especially powerful in situations involving authority, persuasion, or social control. When people feel manipulated, coerced, or patronized, they often become resistant, not because they disagree with the content of what's being said, but because of how it's being said. Even well-intentioned advice can provoke reactance if it comes across as controlling. For instance, a teenager might reject sound advice from a parent simply because it feels like an imposition, not because they doubt its truth. This response is not confined to adolescence or rebellion. Adults experience reactance too, often in subtle and complex ways. In marketing, consumers may reject a product if they feel the advertisement is too pushy. In politics, individuals may harden their views when they perceive opposing arguments as moralistic or threatening to their values. In relationships, people may pull away when they feel their personal boundaries are being encroached upon. In all of these cases, the underlying motivation is to defend the self's perceived freedom of thought and choice. Ironically, attempts to reduce conflict or promote compliance can backfire if they unintentionally activate psychological reactance. The more overt or forceful the pressure, the more people may dig in their heels. That's why strategies that emphasize autonomy, such as offering choices, using subtle language, or appealing to intrinsic motivations, are often more effective than direct demands. Respecting people's sense of agency can disarm reactance and open the door to genuine engagement. At its core, psychological reactance reveals a fundamental aspect of human psychology, the deep need to feel in control of one's own actions and decisions. It reflects not just a desire to be free, but a refusal to be passively directed. Recognizing this response in ourselves and others can lead to more thoughtful communication, greater respect for boundaries, and more effective influence that works with people's autonomy rather than against it. Fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is a well-documented concept in social psychology that describes the tendency for people to overemphasize personal traits and internal characteristics when explaining the behavior of others, while underestimating the influence of external, situational factors. In other words, when someone else makes a mistake or acts in a particular way, we are quick to attribute that behavior to who they are, their personality, morals, or intentions, rather than considering what circumstances they might be facing. This cognitive bias often happens automatically and without conscious awareness. For instance, if a coworker arrives late to a meeting, we might instinctively assume they are careless or disorganized, rather than considering that they might have been stuck in unexpected traffic or delayed by a family emergency. We assign blame to their character before we ask about context. Interestingly, when we explain our own behavior, we tend to do the opposite. We are much more likely to cite external factors to justify our actions. If we are late, we blame traffic or a last-minute phone call, not our own disorganization. This imbalance between how we perceive ourselves and how we judge others forms the core of the fundamental attribution error. The reason this bias is so prevalent lies partly in how human attention works. When we observe others, the person is the focal point of our attention, while the background circumstances fade into the periphery. We notice what they did, not necessarily what situation they were in. But when we evaluate our own behavior, we have direct access to all the contextual details and internal thoughts that influenced our decisions. This difference in perspective leads to skewed interpretations. The fundamental attribution error has powerful implications in everyday life. It can distort how we perceive strangers, colleagues, public figures, and even loved ones. In conflicts, it can cause unnecessary judgment or resentment, as we misread someone's intentions based on incomplete information. In broader social contexts, it can contribute to stereotyping and harsh attitudes, as we attribute complex behavior to fixed character flaws rather than understanding the pressures or systems influencing it. Understanding this bias doesn't mean ignoring responsibility or excusing poor behavior, but it encourages a more balanced and compassionate way of interpreting human actions. By learning to pause and consider the possible situational forces at play, we can become more fair-minded observers and more empathetic participants in social interactions. Recognizing the fundamental attribution error invites us to shift from quick judgment to deeper curiosity, asking not just what someone did, but why, and whether there's more to the story than we first assumed. Self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, often abbreviated as SDT, is a psychological framework that explores human motivation and the conditions that foster optimal functioning, personal growth, and well-being. Developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, the theory posits that people have inherent psychological needs that, when fulfilled, lead to greater motivation and healthier development. These needs are not learned or culturally conditioned, rather, they are universal and essential for psychological health. The three central needs identified by the theory are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy refers to the feeling of being the origin of one's actions, that one is acting out of personal choice rather than external pressure. When people feel that they are freely choosing their actions, they are more likely to be motivated, engaged, and satisfied. Competence involves a sense of effectiveness in one's activities and the belief that one can master challenges and achieve goals. Relatedness is the feeling of connection to others, the sense of being cared for and of belonging in a social group or community. Self-determination theory distinguishes between two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation arises when individuals engage in an activity purely for its own sake, because it is enjoyable, interesting, or meaningful. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, comes from external rewards or pressures, such as money, grades, or social approval. According to SDT, while extrinsic motivation is not inherently negative, its effects on motivation depend heavily on whether it supports or undermines the person's sense of autonomy. When external rewards feel controlling, they can diminish intrinsic motivation. However, when they are perceived as supportive or aligned with one's values, they can coexist with or even enhance self-motivation. One of the most profound insights of self-determination theory is that environments, whether educational, workplace, family, or social, play a significant role in either nurturing or thwarting these basic needs. An autonomy-supportive environment that offers choice, acknowledges emotions, and encourages initiative is more likely to promote sustained motivation and well-being. In contrast, environments that are controlling, punitive, or excessively focused on external rewards can lead to disengagement, burnout, or a sense of helplessness. Importantly, self-determination theory has been supported by a wide range of empirical studies across cultures and domains. It has been used to inform practices in education, healthcare, sports, parenting, and organizational management, all with the aim of creating conditions that allow people to thrive rather than merely comply. At its core, SDT is a theory of human flourishing, emphasizing that when people feel autonomous, competent, and connected, they are more likely to act with vitality, integrity, and resilience. Attachment theory. Attachment theory is a psychological framework that explains how early relationships between infants and caregivers shape a person's emotional development, social functioning, and capacity to form bonds throughout life. Originally developed by British psychologist John Bowlby in the mid-20th century and later expanded by developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, the theory posits that the way a child experiences care, comfort, and security in infancy becomes the blueprint for how they relate to others in adulthood. Bowlby argued that human beings are biologically wired to seek closeness and protection from caregivers, especially in times of stress or uncertainty. This attachment system, he believed, evolved as a survival mechanism. Infants who stayed near attentive caregivers were more likely to survive dangers in the environment. But beyond physical survival, these early bonds also serve a deep emotional purpose. A child who consistently experiences their caregiver as a source of safety, comfort, and responsiveness develops a sense of internal security. This sense of trust in others, and in the world as a safe place, forms what Bowlby called an internal working model, a mental representation of how relationships function and whether others can be counted on for support. Mary Ainsworth extended Bowlby's ideas through empirical research, most notably through the strange situation experiment. In this structured observation, infants were briefly separated from their caregivers and then reunited, allowing researchers to observe how the children responded to stress and reunion. Ainsworth identified several distinct patterns of attachment based on these observations: secure attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment, and avoidant attachment. Later research added a fourth type, disorganized attachment, which often arises in the context of trauma or neglect. Children with secure attachment tended to explore their environment confidently, knowing that their caregiver would return and provide comfort. Those with insecure attachment styles, on the other hand, either clung anxiously to their caregiver, avoided closeness, or displayed confused and contradictory behaviors. These patterns were not random, they reflected the consistency, sensitivity, and emotional availability of the caregiving the child had received. What makes attachment theory so enduring and impactful is that it connects early childhood experiences to later emotional and relational patterns. Adults often carry forward their attachment styles into romantic relationships, friendships, and even workplace dynamics. Someone with a secure attachment is likely to feel comfortable with intimacy, trust others easily, and handle conflict with resilience. In contrast, someone with an anxious attachment may crave closeness but fear abandonment, while an avoidant individual might struggle with emotional intimacy and prefer independence to vulnerability. Disorganized attachment, often rooted in early trauma, can lead to contradictory behaviors, both seeking and fearing closeness. Importantly, attachment styles are not fixed destinies. While early relationships leave a powerful imprint, people can and do change through self-awareness, therapy, and healthy relationships. The attachment system is dynamic, meaning that new experiences, especially those involving consistent care, emotional availability, and trust, can reshape one's internal models over time. Attachment theory has had a profound influence on many areas of psychology, including developmental psychology, psychotherapy, education, and even neuroscience. It highlights the deep and lasting impact of early emotional bonds, revealing how our earliest connections become the invisible architecture of the self. At its core, the theory affirms a simple but powerful truth: human beings are profoundly shaped by love, safety, and connection. Our need to bond is not a weakness but a fundamental part of who we are, from cradle to grave. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological concept introduced by Leon Festinger in the late 1950s, which describes the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two or more conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes, or when their behavior is inconsistent with their self-image or moral principles. This inner tension is not merely a fleeting emotional reaction, it is a powerful psychological state that motivates individuals to reduce the inconsistency and restore a sense of internal harmony. At its core, cognitive dissonance reflects the human desire for psychological consistency. People want to believe that their thoughts, actions, and values are in alignment. When they experience a contradiction, such as behaving in a way that clashes with what they believe or discovering new information that challenges a previously held opinion, it creates a state of dissonance. This uncomfortable tension drives a process of resolution, in which individuals unconsciously or consciously attempt to reconcile the conflict. There are several ways people reduce dissonance, and these strategies often shape how they think and behave. One common response is to change the conflicting belief. For instance, someone who values health but smokes cigarettes might begin to downplay the health risks or question the validity of the science, thus adjusting their beliefs to match their behavior. Another way to reduce dissonance is by changing the behavior itself, such as quitting smoking to align actions with values. Alternatively, people might add new justifications that help bridge the gap, such as convincing themselves that smoking relieves stress, which in turn supports their overall well-being. Festinger's original experiments illustrated how people adjust their attitudes to avoid dissonance, even in trivial situations. In one study, participants who were paid a small amount of money to lie about a boring task later reported enjoying the task more than those who were paid a larger sum. The small payment was not enough to justify the lie externally, so the participants internally changed their attitude about the task to make sense of their behavior. This showed that when external justification is insufficient, people will often change their internal beliefs to reduce dissonance. Cognitive dissonance operates across many areas of life, from personal decisions and relationships to politics and religion. It explains why people may cling to beliefs even when presented with contradictory evidence, and why admitting mistakes can be so difficult. It also sheds light on phenomena such as post-decision rationalization, where individuals amplify the positives of a choice they made while downplaying the positives of alternatives they rejected, in order to feel more confident in their decision. Importantly, while dissonance can cause discomfort, it can also be a force for growth. Experiencing contradiction forces individuals to reflect, reevaluate, and sometimes change. In this way, dissonance is not simply a sign of inner conflict but also an opportunity for transformation. People often emerge from it with a clearer sense of their values, beliefs, and direction. In psychological theory and everyday life alike, cognitive dissonance highlights the complexity of human motivation. It reveals that we are not purely rational beings, but emotional and meaning-seeking creatures who constantly strive for coherence between what we think, what we do, and who we believe ourselves to be. This need for internal consistency is a quiet but constant force shaping our decisions, attitudes, and identities. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a psychological tendency in which individuals favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs or expectations while simultaneously dismissing, ignoring, or undervaluing evidence that challenges those beliefs. This mental shortcut operates largely outside of conscious awareness and affects how people gather, interpret, and recall information. Rather than seeking objective truth, the mind often seeks coherence and consistency with what it already holds to be true. As a result, confirmation bias subtly distorts reasoning and decision-making in ways that can reinforce misconceptions and entrench existing views. This bias plays out across many areas of life, from everyday judgments to scientific reasoning, political discourse, and interpersonal relationships. For instance, when someone holds a strong opinion about a social issue, they are more likely to notice news stories or expert opinions that support their stance and less likely to engage seriously with contradictory evidence. Even when confronted with facts that clearly challenge their viewpoint, they may scrutinize that information more harshly, question its credibility, or interpret it in a way that aligns with their original belief. This selective processing creates a feedback loop, strengthening confidence in one's position without genuinely expanding understanding. Memory itself is not immune to this effect. People often remember details that support their beliefs more vividly or accurately than those that contradict them. In debates, it is common to recall the moments that validated one's arguments while forgetting or downplaying instances that exposed flaws. Over time, this biased recall contributes to an increasingly one-sided internal narrative, further solidifying the original perspective. Confirmation bias serves a psychological function by providing emotional comfort and cognitive efficiency. It reduces the discomfort of cognitive dissonance, that unsettling feeling that arises when contradictory information threatens a deeply held belief. By unconsciously filtering out dissonant ideas, the mind preserves a sense of internal harmony and predictability. However, this comfort comes at a cost. It limits intellectual openness, fosters groupthink, and undermines critical thinking. In a broader social context, it contributes to polarization, as people surround themselves with like-minded voices and become more resistant to alternative views. Despite its pervasive influence, confirmation bias is not insurmountable. Becoming aware of its presence is the first step toward counteracting its effects. Practices such as actively seeking out opposing viewpoints, questioning initial assumptions, and engaging in reflective thinking can help mitigate its influence. In scientific research, peer review and falsifiability are structured methods designed to guard against the distorting effects of confirmation bias. In personal life, humility, curiosity, and honest dialogue offer a way to expand understanding rather than simply reinforce belief. Ultimately, confirmation bias reveals an important truth about the human mind, that we often see the world not as it is, but as we are. Recognizing this tendency opens the door to greater intellectual honesty and deeper insight, not only into how we think, but into how we might think better. Dual process theory. Dual process theory is a foundational idea in cognitive psychology that explains how human thinking operates through two distinct systems of thought, one fast, intuitive, and automatic, and the other slow, deliberate, and effortful. This theory provides a framework for understanding the complexity of reasoning, decision-making, and judgment by acknowledging that our minds often function on different cognitive tracks, sometimes in harmony, but frequently in conflict. The first system, often referred to as System 1, handles mental operations that occur quickly and with little conscious effort. It governs our instinctive reactions, gut feelings, and the snap judgments we make in everyday life. This system relies heavily on heuristics, mental shortcuts drawn from past experiences and patterns, enabling us to navigate the world efficiently and respond rapidly to our environment. It is what allows us to recognize a familiar face instantly, drive a well-known route without much thought, or detect danger in someone's tone or expression. While System 1 is highly adaptive and indispensable for survival, it is also prone to biases and errors because it sacrifices accuracy for speed. System 2, by contrast, is slower, more analytical, and consciously controlled. It is activated when we encounter unfamiliar problems, engage in critical thinking, or deliberate over complex decisions. This system involves logical reasoning, mental effort, and sustained attention. Tasks such as solving a math problem, evaluating evidence, or planning for the future typically require the involvement of System 2. Because it consumes more cognitive resources, people often rely on it only when necessary, and even then, not always thoroughly or consistently. The interaction between these two systems plays a crucial role in shaping our thoughts and actions. Often, System 1 delivers an immediate impression or answer, and System 2 either endorses it without much scrutiny or steps in to override it if the stakes are high or if there is enough cognitive motivation. For example, when asked a tricky question that seems simple at first glance, one might initially offer an intuitive but incorrect answer from System 1, which system may second correct if the person takes time to reflect. One of the key insights from dual process theory is that the reliance on System 1 can lead to systematic errors in judgment, what psychologists call cognitive biases. Because System 1 operates on shortcuts and emotions, it can mislead us, especially when information is incomplete, complex, or emotionally charged. Yet, System 2 is not infallible either. It can be lazy, overconfident in the outputs of System 1, or influenced by motivated reasoning. This theory has broad implications across psychology, economics, behavioral science, and even law and education. It helps explain why people sometimes make irrational choices, why they struggle with statistics or probabilities, and why they might persist in false beliefs even when contrary evidence is presented. It also illuminates the challenge of changing minds, not merely because of ignorance, but because intuitive impressions feel compelling and often go unchallenged by slower, rational scrutiny. Understanding dual process theory encourages a more nuanced view of human cognition. It reminds us that while intuition can be a powerful guide, it should not always be trusted without reflection. And though reasoning can lead to better decisions, it requires awareness, effort, and the humility to question our immediate impressions. In a world full of information, persuasion, and complexity, the ability to recognize which system is operating, and when to engage the other, is a cornerstone of clear thinking and sound judgment. Flow state. Flow state, often simply called flow, is a psychological condition in which a person becomes fully immersed in an activity, experiencing a sense of energized focus, deep involvement, and enjoyment in the process. The concept was introduced by psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who studied what makes life feel most rewarding. He found that people report the greatest sense of fulfillment not when they are relaxing or indulging in passive pleasure, but when they are engaged in challenging tasks that require full concentration and skill. Flow is that optimal state of consciousness where individuals are so absorbed in what they are doing that everything else seems to fade away, including awareness of time, fatigue, and even the self. In a flow state, the mind becomes quiet, yet highly alert. Attention is completely channeled into the task at hand, and irrelevant thoughts, worries, or distractions drop away. Action and awareness begin to merge, and people often describe the experience as effortless or automatic, even when the task is complex or demanding. This deep focus generates a feeling of control, mastery, and presence. Time tends to feel distorted, minutes may seem to pass like seconds, or hours can disappear unnoticed. Flow typically occurs when the challenge of the task is well matched to the individual's skill level. If the task is too easy, the person may become bored; if it's too difficult, they may become anxious or frustrated. But when challenge and skill are in balance, the person is pushed to the edge of their abilities in a way that is stimulating rather than overwhelming. This delicate balance is what makes flow both exhilarating and productive. It is a space where learning, performance, and creativity can reach their peak. Importantly, flow is not limited to artistic or athletic pursuits, though it is often associated with them. People can experience flow while coding, writing, gardening, teaching, playing chess, or even having an engaging conversation. What matters is not the nature of the activity itself, but the quality of the engagement. It must be meaningful, goal-directed, and structured in a way that allows for clear feedback and progressive improvement. Flow is deeply rewarding in part because it suspends the inner critic. During flow, self-consciousness diminishes, and individuals are freed from doubts or judgments about their performance. This release can foster confidence and intrinsic motivation, encouraging people to return to the activity again and again, not for external rewards, but for the joy of the experience itself. Over time, engaging regularly in flow-producing activities can contribute significantly to a person's overall sense of fulfillment and well-being. In essence, flow represents a merging of doing and being, a state where we are not simply completing a task, but living fully in the moment of its unfolding. It reveals a core truth about human nature, that we are at our best not when we are avoiding difficulty, but when we are deeply engaged in purposeful effort that challenges us to grow. Growth versus fixed mindset. The concept of growth versus fixed mindset, developed by psychologist Carol Dweck, explores the profound impact that one's beliefs about their own abilities have on motivation, learning, and achievement. At its core, this psychological idea centers around how individuals perceive intelligence, talent, and personal change, whether these qualities are seen as static traits or as capacities that can be developed through effort and experience. A fixed mindset is grounded in the belief that a person's abilities are innate and unchangeable. Someone who holds this view tends to see intelligence or talent as something you either have or you don't. Success, in this mindset, becomes a reflection of inherent ability, and failure is seen as evidence of one's limitations. Because of this, individuals with a fixed mindset often avoid challenges that might expose their perceived deficiencies. They may fear failure not only for the disappointment it brings but because it threatens their self-image. As a result, they may prefer to stick with tasks they already excel at, seeking validation rather than growth. In contrast, a growth mindset is based on the belief that abilities and intelligence can be cultivated through dedication, learning, and perseverance. From this perspective, effort is not a sign of weakness but a pathway to mastery. Mistakes and setbacks are viewed as essential components of the learning process rather than as verdicts on one's worth or potential. People with a growth mindset are more likely to embrace challenges, persist through difficulties, and see failure as an opportunity to improve. This orientation fosters resilience and a love for learning because it shifts the focus from proving oneself to developing oneself. These differing mindsets influence not only how people approach goals but also how they respond to feedback and the success of others. Those with a fixed mindset may feel threatened by others' achievements, interpreting them as a reflection of their own inadequacy. Those with a growth mindset, however, are more inclined to be inspired by others, seeing success as something attainable through effort and strategy. Importantly, Dweck's research shows that mindsets are not fixed themselves. They can be influenced by the messages people receive from parents, teachers, and culture at large. For instance, when children are praised for being smart, rather than for their effort or strategies, they may come to equate their worth with performance and develop a fixed mindset. In contrast, when they are praised for persistence, problem-solving, or learning from mistakes, they are more likely to internalize a growth-oriented view of themselves. The implications of this theory are far-reaching. In education, fostering a growth mindset can improve academic performance and increase students' willingness to tackle difficult subjects. In the workplace, it can encourage innovation and collaboration, as employees become more open to feedback and experimentation. In personal life, adopting a growth mindset can lead to greater emotional resilience and more fulfilling relationships. At its essence, the growth versus fixed mindset framework challenges us to reconsider how we define ability and how we respond to difficulty. It suggests that the key to excellence is not inborn talent but the willingness to stretch, struggle, and grow. This shift in thinking empowers individuals to take ownership of their development, recognizing that who they are is not a finished product, but a continuous process of becoming. Hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation is the psychological process through which people return to a relatively stable baseline of happiness, regardless of significant positive or negative life events. This idea suggests that while external circumstances, such as a job promotion, marriage, a new possession, or even a loss, can temporarily affect one's emotional state, over time, the emotional intensity fades and individuals gradually return to their habitual level of happiness or unhappiness. In essence, people become accustomed to both joys and sorrows, which reduces their long-term impact on well-being. This phenomenon can be observed in many everyday experiences. A person may feel elated after buying a new car, moving into a bigger home, or receiving public recognition, but as days turn into weeks, the initial excitement often gives way to familiarity, and the emotional uplift diminishes. The same process applies in reverse. After experiencing a setback, such as a breakup, job loss, or injury, most people eventually adjust and find themselves feeling better than they initially expected. This capacity to emotionally rebound, whether upward or downward, demonstrates the adaptive nature of the human psyche. Hedonic adaptation is partly driven by our tendency to focus on what changes, rather than what remains constant. Novelty attracts our attention and heightens emotion, but as that novelty fades, so does the intensity of our feelings. What once thrilled us becomes part of the background of daily life. Expectations also play a role. As people achieve new successes, they often adjust their standards, wanting more or different things to feel satisfied. This can lead to a treadmill effect, where individuals chase new goals or possessions, believing that each new achievement will finally bring lasting happiness, only to find themselves returning to the same emotional baseline again and again. Understanding hedonic adaptation has profound implications for how we pursue happiness. It suggests that lasting contentment is less about acquiring external rewards and more about cultivating internal states, such as gratitude, mindfulness, or meaning, that are less susceptible to fading over time. It also points to the importance of variety and intentional engagement in life's experiences, rather than relying on any single achievement or acquisition to bring lasting joy. At its core, hedonic adaptation reveals both a challenge and a resilience in human nature. The challenge lies in the way it can undermine long-term satisfaction, keeping people in a cycle of seeking more without feeling more fulfilled. But its resilience offers protection, softening the blow of life's hardships and helping people recover emotionally from what once seemed unbearable. In this way, hedonic adaptation is a double-edged but deeply human aspect of psychological life, a reminder that while circumstances change, our minds often strive to return to familiar emotional ground. Impostor Syndrome. Impostor syndrome is a psychological pattern in which individuals doubt their accomplishments and have a persistent, often internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud, despite clear evidence of their competence or success. It is not a formal mental disorder, but rather a common and deeply felt experience that can affect people across all walks of life, particularly those in high-achieving roles or environments. What makes this phenomenon so insidious is that it disconnects external achievements from internal validation, leaving a person feeling as though they have somehow tricked others into overestimating their abilities. The core of impostor syndrome lies in the dissonance between objective achievement and subjective self-perception. Someone may receive awards, promotions, or praise and still feel that they are undeserving, that they only succeeded due to luck, timing, or others' overestimations. Instead of interpreting accomplishments as the result of hard work, skill, or intelligence, the individual attributes them to factors outside of their control. This distorted thinking fosters chronic self-doubt, anxiety, and a sense of unworthiness, even when the individual is, by all external measures, successful. A key feature of this syndrome is the fear of being found out. People who struggle with it often carry a secret belief that they are deceiving those around them, and that eventually someone, whether a boss, a peer, or even a friend, will discover that they are not as capable as they appear. This fear can lead to overworking, perfectionism, or withdrawal, as individuals try either to prove their worth or to avoid situations where their perceived inadequacy might be exposed. Ironically, their continued success only deepens the problem, because they dismiss new accomplishments as further evidence of their ability to maintain the illusion rather than proof of their genuine competence. Impostor syndrome does not necessarily reflect low self-esteem in a global sense. In fact, many who experience it may appear confident, ambitious, and outwardly secure. Internally, however, they struggle with an ongoing conflict between how they are seen and how they see themselves. This internal conflict is often shaped by early family dynamics, cultural pressures, or societal expectations, particularly those that emphasize achievement or perfection. Certain environments and identities are more prone to triggering these feelings. For example, individuals from underrepresented groups in academic, corporate, or creative fields may experience additional pressure to prove themselves, which can intensify feelings of impostorism. In such cases, the syndrome is not just about self-perception but also reflects broader systemic issues that signal to people that they do not truly belong, even when they are qualified. Overcoming imposter syndrome requires a shift in mindset. It involves learning to recognize and challenge self-doubting thoughts, to internalize achievements as real and earned, and to replace perfectionism with self-compassion. It also helps to understand that these feelings are more common than they appear. Many successful people, from students to CEOs, quietly struggle with the same doubts. Bringing the experience into the open, whether through conversation, reflection, or therapy, can break the illusion of isolation that fuels the fear of being a fraud. Ultimately, impostor syndrome reveals the gap that can exist between external success and inner confidence. It shows how powerful beliefs about worth, competence, and identity can shape our lived experience, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary. And it underscores the importance of not only achieving but also believing in ourselves and in the legitimacy of our own path. Internal versus external locus of control. The concept of locus of control refers to an individual's belief about the degree to which they have control over the outcomes in their life. Developed by psychologist Julian Rotter in the 1950s, this idea captures a fundamental aspect of personality and motivation by distinguishing between two orientations, internal and external. At its core, locus of control reflects whether a person attributes success and failure to their own actions or to external forces beyond their influence. People with an internal locus of control tend to believe that they are the architects of their own fate. They see their decisions, efforts, skills, and choices as the primary drivers of what happens to them. When faced with success, they are likely to attribute it to their hard work or smart strategies. When they fail, they often look inward, considering what they might do differently next time. This sense of agency often fosters a proactive mindset, resilience, and a willingness to take responsibility. These individuals are typically more motivated to set goals, solve problems, and persevere in the face of obstacles, because they believe their actions have meaningful consequences. On the other hand, those with an external locus of control believe that their lives are largely shaped by external forces such as luck, fate, chance, or the actions of other people. They may feel that no matter how much effort they put in, outcomes are ultimately determined by circumstances outside their control. This perspective can sometimes lead to feelings of helplessness or passivity, especially in challenging situations. It can also foster a sense of resignation, as individuals might see little point in trying to change a situation they believe is governed by forces beyond them. However, this outlook can also reduce stress in situations where control is genuinely limited, since these individuals may be more accepting of uncertainty and less likely to blame themselves when things go wrong. Locus of control exists on a spectrum rather than as a strict either-or distinction. Most people display a mix of both orientations, depending on the situation. Someone might feel very much in control of their academic or career success but feel powerless in the face of social dynamics or health challenges. Context, culture, upbringing, and life experiences all influence how a person develops their locus of control. For example, a supportive environment that reinforces effort and achievement can strengthen internal control beliefs, whereas unpredictable or unfair experiences may foster an external orientation. The psychological implications of locus of control are profound. A strong internal locus is often associated with greater psychological well-being, better stress management, and higher levels of achievement. Conversely, a predominantly external locus can sometimes be linked to anxiety, depression, or learned helplessness, especially when individuals feel consistently powerless. That said, an overly rigid internal locus may also become problematic, particularly when individuals blame themselves excessively for setbacks that were genuinely out of their control. Understanding locus of control offers valuable insight into how people interpret their experiences and why they respond differently to the same challenges. By recognizing and reflecting on these beliefs, individuals can begin to shift their orientation in ways that promote growth, autonomy, and resilience, acknowledging the role of chance or external forces without surrendering their sense of personal influence. In this way, locus of control not only explains behavior but can guide the development of a more balanced and empowered outlook on life. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a psychological phenomenon in which a person or animal comes to believe that they have no control over their situation, even when opportunities for change or escape are available. This state of passive resignation is not innate. It is acquired through repeated experiences of failure or trauma where efforts to influence outcomes are consistently met with no success. Over time, the individual internalizes the belief that their actions are futile, and this belief persists even when circumstances change for the better. The concept was first discovered through experiments conducted by psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer in the 1960s. In one study, dogs were exposed to unavoidable electric shocks. After repeated exposure, the dogs stopped trying to escape, even when they were later given the opportunity to do so. They had learned that nothing they did made a difference, and thus, they gave up trying altogether. This behavioral pattern was then observed in other animals and, importantly, in humans. In people, learned helplessness often manifests in the face of repeated adversity, such as chronic academic failure, prolonged unemployment, abusive relationships, or ongoing health issues. Over time, individuals may stop trying to improve their circumstances, feeling powerless and defeated. This can lead to a lack of motivation, reduced effort, and eventually depression or anxiety. What makes this condition particularly insidious is that it affects not only behavior but also thought patterns. The person starts to believe that failure is not just likely, but inevitable, and that they are fundamentally incapable or flawed. This mindset can have a deeply corrosive effect on self-esteem, goal setting, and resilience. Even when opportunities arise or support is offered, someone gripped by learned helplessness may not respond. They may view help as pointless or even suspect it won't last. Over time, this can spiral into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By not acting, they ensure the negative outcomes they fear. However, learned helplessness is not irreversible. Therapeutic approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy aim to help individuals recognize and challenge these defeatist beliefs, rebuilding a sense of agency and control. Repeated experiences of small successes and supportive environments can gradually restore hope and motivation. At its core, overcoming learned helplessness requires a reconnection between action and outcome, a rebuilding of trust in one's own ability to effect change. Understanding learned helplessness is crucial not only in treating psychological conditions but also in designing environments, whether in schools, workplaces, or homes, that empower rather than discourage, and that help people rediscover their capacity to influence their lives. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a motivational theory in psychology proposed by Abraham Maslow in 1943 that describes how human beings prioritize their needs in a structured, ascending order. At the foundation of the theory is the idea that people are driven by the desire to fulfill certain basic requirements before they can pursue higher-level psychological and self-fulfillment goals. These needs are organized in a hierarchy, where the satisfaction of each level forms the foundation for pursuing the next. At the most fundamental level, Maslow believed that individuals are motivated to meet their physiological needs, those essential for survival. When a person lacks necessities such as food, water, or sleep, these concerns dominate attention and behavior, overriding all other desires. Only when these basic requirements are met can people begin to focus on the next level, the need for safety. This includes the desire for physical security, stability, and protection from harm or danger. Individuals who live in unstable or threatening environments, such as war zones or abusive households, are often unable to pursue higher needs because their sense of security remains uncertain. Once both physiological and safety needs are reasonably satisfied, people naturally seek love and belonging. This involves the need for close relationships, emotional connection, and social inclusion. Whether through family, friendships, romantic relationships, or community, this level reflects the human need to feel accepted and part of something greater than oneself. When individuals experience isolation or rejection, it can lead to profound psychological distress, signaling that this social need remains unfulfilled. Building on the foundation of belonging, the next level in Maslow's hierarchy is the need for esteem. This includes the pursuit of respect, recognition, and a sense of achievement, both self-respect and the respect of others. People at this stage strive for personal accomplishment, competence, and the validation that their efforts and presence matter. When these esteem needs are thwarted, individuals may experience feelings of inferiority, insecurity, or helplessness. At the top of the hierarchy is the need for self-actualization, the realization of one's fullest potential. This is not simply about achieving external success but involves becoming the most authentic version of oneself. It may express itself through creativity, moral growth, intellectual exploration, or meaningful contributions to society. A self-actualized person lives with purpose, pursuing personal growth not out of necessity but from a deep sense of meaning and inner fulfillment. Maslow emphasized that these needs are not rigid or universally experienced in a fixed order. While the general progression tends to follow the hierarchy, individual experiences, cultural differences, or life circumstances can alter the sequence or intensity of certain needs. Some people might pursue artistic expression even in the midst of hardship, or prioritize justice and moral ideals over personal safety. Over time, Maslow expanded his theory to include additional levels beyond self-actualization, including cognitive and aesthetic needs, such as the pursuit of knowledge and the appreciation of beauty, and, eventually, the need for self-transcendence, where individuals seek meaning beyond the self, through altruism, spirituality, or service to others. In essence, Maslow's hierarchy of needs offers a powerful framework for understanding human motivation, one that sees individuals not as driven solely by survival or desire, but by an intrinsic urge toward growth, connection, and fulfillment. It reveals that while we all share fundamental needs, the journey toward becoming whole and fully human is as much about striving for meaning and purpose as it is about meeting material demands. Milgram's obedience study. Milgram's obedience study stands as one of the most famous, and controversial, experiments in the history of psychology, shedding light on the powerful influence of authority on human behavior. Conducted in the early 1960s by Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram, the study aimed to investigate a chilling question that had arisen in the aftermath of World War II: how could ordinary people commit atrocities simply by following orders? To explore this, Milgram designed an experiment that created the illusion of a situation in which one person was ordered to inflict pain on another. Volunteers who believed they were participating in a study on learning and memory were assigned the role of teacher. They were told their task was to administer increasingly strong electric shocks to a learner each time the learner made a mistake on a memory task. The learner, however, was actually a confederate, an actor, and no real shocks were delivered. The setup included a fake shock generator with labeled switches ranging from mild jolts to dangerously high voltages, including labels like extreme intensity shock and XXX. As the supposed shocks increased, the learner began to cry out in pain, beg for the experiment to stop, and eventually fell silent, suggesting they had been seriously harmed or were unconscious. Throughout this ordeal, an authority figure in a lab coat calmly urged the teacher to continue, using standard phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue." Despite the apparent suffering of the learner, a startling number of participants continued to administer shock simply because they were told to. In the original study, 65% of participants went all the way to the highest voltage level, even though many showed signs of extreme stress, discomfort, and internal conflict. They sweated, trembled, and questioned the ethics of their actions, but most still complied with the authority figure's commands. What Milgram's study revealed was the unsettling ease with which ordinary people could be led to engage in harmful behavior when placed under the pressure of an authoritative figure. It challenged the comforting belief that only sadistic or morally defective individuals could participate in cruelty. Instead, the results suggested that context and social structure play a massive role in shaping human behavior, so much so that individuals can act against their conscience if they believe they are simply carrying out the will of an authority. The implications of the study rippled far beyond psychology, influencing fields such as ethics, law, and military training. It raised deep moral questions about personal responsibility, the power of institutional systems, and the conditions under which people surrender their autonomy. The experiment also spurred intense debate over the ethics of psychological research itself, given the emotional stress it caused participants. While they were thoroughly debriefed afterward and no physical harm occurred, the study prompted changes in how research involving human subjects is conducted, with greater emphasis on informed consent and psychological well-being. Milgram's obedience study ultimately revealed a profound truth about the human condition, that obedience is not simply a matter of willpower or morality, but is deeply embedded in the structure of authority and the social roles people inhabit. It reminds us that the capacity for both compassion and cruelty lies within us all, and that understanding the social forces that shape our decisions is crucial to preventing the repetition of history's darkest moments. Mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are a special class of brain cells that activate both when an individual performs an action and when they observe someone else performing the same action. First discovered in the early 1990s by a team of neuroscientists led by Giacomo Rizzolatti in Italy, these neurons were initially observed in the premotor cortex of monkeys. The researchers found that certain neurons fired not only when a monkey grasped an object, but also when it watched another monkey, or even a human, perform the same grasping movement. This suggested that the brain does not just respond to actions we do ourselves, but also to those we witness in others. The implications of this discovery are profound. Mirror neurons appear to be a key neurological mechanism underlying empathy, imitation, and social understanding. They help us grasp the intentions, emotions, and behaviors of others by simulating them internally. When we see someone smile or wince in pain, our mirror neurons generate a kind of internal echo of that experience, allowing us to feel what the other person is feeling without consciously thinking about it. This capacity for shared experience may be the foundation for empathy, as it allows us to intuitively connect with others on an emotional level. In early childhood development, mirror neurons may play a critical role in learning through imitation. Infants observe the actions of caregivers, such as speaking, gesturing, or using tools, and begin to mimic them, often before fully understanding their meaning. This ability to mirror and internalize the behavior of others is essential not only for language acquisition and motor skills but also for understanding social norms and emotional cues. Some scientists and psychologists believe that dysfunction in the mirror neuron system could be linked to certain developmental conditions, such as autism spectrum disorder, where difficulties in social interaction and empathy are common. While this theory is still debated and under investigation, it highlights the potential significance of mirror neurons in shaping how we relate to others. Beyond clinical relevance, mirror neurons have captured public imagination because they seem to bridge the divide between self and other. They reveal a deeply social nature of the brain, a wiring that predisposes us to connection, learning, and mutual understanding. Rather than being isolated observers of the world, we are neurologically designed to participate in it with others, emotionally and cognitively. The discovery of mirror neurons offers a scientific explanation for why we flinch when we see someone get hurt, laugh when others laugh, and feel a surge of joy at another's success. It confirms something long intuited by artists, teachers, and caregivers alike, that we are built to feel with and learn from one another. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is a psychological tendency in which individuals attribute their successes to internal factors, such as their own skills, effort, or intelligence, while blaming failures on external circumstances beyond their control. This pattern of thinking allows people to protect their self-esteem, maintain a positive self-image, and navigate the challenges of daily life without being overwhelmed by self-doubt. It reflects a deeply rooted motivational need to see oneself in a favorable light, even at the expense of objectivity. When someone performs well on an exam, they are likely to credit their intelligence, preparation, or diligence. However, if they perform poorly, they may be more inclined to blame a poorly written test, an unfair teacher, or distractions in the environment. Similarly, in professional settings, a person might attribute a successful project outcome to their leadership or creativity, but if the project fails, they may point to team dysfunction, lack of resources, or bad timing. These explanations may not be entirely false, but they tend to be selectively constructed in ways that preserve the individual's sense of competence and worth. The self-serving bias is not typically a conscious act of deception. Rather, it operates automatically and subtly, shaping perceptions, memories, and judgments in ways that feel natural and reasonable to the person experiencing them. It reflects the mind's attempt to manage emotional discomfort and cognitive dissonance, the mental tension that arises when outcomes do not align with one's self-concept. By blaming failure on external factors and claiming ownership of success, individuals can reduce that tension and protect their psychological well-being. However, while self-serving bias may serve a protective function, it can also have significant downsides. It can distort self-awareness, hinder personal growth, and strain relationships. People who consistently deflect responsibility may struggle to learn from their mistakes or receive constructive feedback. In group settings, this bias can lead to conflict, as individuals are more likely to claim credit and less likely to accept blame, making collaboration and accountability more difficult. Interestingly, cultural influences shape how this bias manifests. In individualistic cultures, where personal achievement is highly valued, self-serving attributions are often more pronounced. In collectivist cultures, where group harmony and modesty are emphasized, people may be more likely to attribute success to external support or luck and may even downplay personal achievement. Despite its pitfalls, the self-serving bias is a deeply human response, rooted in our need for psychological resilience. It helps people maintain confidence in the face of failure and encourages persistence through setbacks. Recognizing this bias in ourselves is the first step toward more balanced thinking. By learning to accept responsibility when things go wrong and to view success with humility, individuals can foster both personal integrity and stronger, more authentic connections with others. Ultimately, awareness of the self-serving bias does not mean suppressing the desire to feel good about ourselves. It means tempering that desire with honesty, openness, and a commitment to self-improvement. The Big Five Personality Traits. The Big Five Personality Traits, also known as the Five-Factor Model, is a widely accepted and empirically supported framework for understanding human personality. It proposes that individual differences in personality can be broadly categorized into 5 dimensions that remain relatively stable across time, culture, and life circumstances. These dimensions do not represent fixed categories but rather spectrums along which each person falls, capturing the complexity and uniqueness of human behavior in a scientifically measurable way. The origin of the Big Five can be traced to linguistic and statistical research, where psychologists analyze thousands of descriptive words people use to characterize one another. Through factor analysis, a statistical method used to identify patterns, researchers discovered that 5 major clusters of traits consistently emerged across different studies. These 5 dimensions became known as openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Each of these traits reflects a broad domain of psychological functioning. Openness to experience describes the extent to which a person is imaginative, curious, and open to new ideas, feelings, and experiences. Those high in openness tend to embrace novelty, while those lower in this trait may prefer routine, familiarity, and concrete thinking. Conscientiousness involves self-discipline, organization, and a focus on goal-directed behavior. It is a strong predictor of academic and occupational success, as individuals high in conscientiousness are typically reliable, methodical, and persistent. Extroversion reflects a person's level of sociability, energy, and assertiveness. Extroverts are energized by social interaction, enjoy being around others, and are often perceived as outgoing and enthusiastic. Introverts, on the other hand, may be more reserved, reflective, and comfortable with solitude, although this doesn't necessarily imply shyness or social anxiety. Agreeableness refers to a person's tendency to be compassionate, cooperative, and motivated by social harmony. Highly agreeable individuals are often trusting, empathetic, and generous, while those lower in agreeableness may be more skeptical, competitive, or self-focused. Neuroticism, the final dimension, involves the tendency to experience negative emotions such as anxiety, sadness, irritability, and emotional instability. People who score high in neuroticism are more sensitive to stress and may struggle with mood regulation, whereas those low in this trait are typically more emotionally resilient and stable. What makes the Big Five model particularly powerful is its descriptive clarity and practical applicability. Unlike some personality theories that focus on types or archetypes, the Big Five allows for nuanced combinations of traits, recognizing that a person might be highly conscientious and introverted, or extrovert but low in agreeableness, and so on. These dimensions interact in complex ways, shaping everything from interpersonal relationships to career preferences and coping strategies. The Big Five traits have also been found to be relatively stable over the lifespan, though some gradual shifts occur with age. For example, people often become more conscientious and agreeable as they grow older, while traits like neuroticism and extroversion may decline slightly. Cultural and environmental influences, life experiences, and individual choices also play a role in how these traits are expressed. In modern psychology, the Big Five serves as a foundational tool in personality research, counseling, organizational behavior, and even artificial intelligence. It offers a language for understanding oneself and others without reducing people to simplistic labels. By acknowledging both stability and variation, the Big Five model highlights the richness of human personality, showing that while we share broad patterns of behavior, each of us expresses these traits in ways that are deeply personal and context-dependent. The Spotlight Effect. The spotlight effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to overestimate the extent to which their actions, appearance, or mistakes are noticed and judged by others. It arises from the natural human tendency to be the center of our own experiences. Because we are so acutely aware of what we are doing, wearing, or feeling, we mistakenly assume that others are equally focused on us. In reality, most people are too preoccupied with their own concerns to pay as much attention to us as we imagine. This effect was formally studied by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky, who found that individuals consistently believe they are under a brighter metaphorical spotlight than they actually are. In one experiment, participants who were asked to wear an embarrassing T-shirt into a room full of strangers thought that far more people had noticed it than actually did. The discrepancy between perception and reality revealed how inflated our sense of being observed can be. The spotlight effect is not limited to clothing or embarrassment. It can influence how we perceive our social performance, public speaking, or even casual interactions. A person might dwell on a minor social misstep, such as stumbling over a word or spilling a drink, convinced that it left a strong impression on everyone around them. In truth, most observers either didn't notice or quickly forgot about it. This bias can lead to unnecessary anxiety, self-consciousness, and even social withdrawal, especially in situations that already feel vulnerable or exposing. It can make people hesitate to speak up, try something new, or take risks, all because they fear scrutiny that is likely exaggerated or non-existent. On the flip side, understanding the spotlight effect can be incredibly liberating. Realizing that others are far less focused on our perceived flaws than we think can reduce pressure and increase confidence. At its core, the spotlight effect is a distortion of perspective. It reminds us that while we are each the main character in our own story, we are merely background figures in the stories of most others. Embracing this can lead to greater freedom, self-acceptance, and a more balanced view of how we fit into the social world. The Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most infamous and controversial studies in the history of psychology, conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. Its purpose was to explore how ordinary people might behave when placed in positions of power or subjugation, and how social roles and environmental conditions could influence behavior. What began as a simulated prison study quickly devolved into a disturbing demonstration of how easily human behavior can be shaped, and in some cases, corrupted, by situational forces. In the experiment, 24 psychologically healthy male college students were randomly assigned to take on the role of either prisoner or guard in a mock prison constructed in the basement of a Stanford building. The participants were meant to enact this simulated prison life over a 2-week period. The prisoners were arrested at their homes without warning, brought to the mock facility, stripped, deloused, and assigned numbers in place of their names. The guards were given uniforms, whistles, sunglasses to obscure eye contact, and full control over the daily routines and discipline within the prison environment. Very quickly, the situation began to deteriorate. Within just a few days, the guards began exhibiting authoritarian and, in some cases, sadistic behavior. They imposed increasingly harsh and humiliating punishments on the prisoners, many of whom began showing signs of emotional distress, passivity, and confusion. Despite knowing the situation was artificial, the participants increasingly identified with their assigned roles, and the line between simulation and reality blurred. The guards embraced their authority, while the prisoners became submissive or emotionally unstable, some even begging to be released. Zimbardo himself played the role of prison superintendent, and his immersion in the role contributed to a lack of objectivity and ethical oversight. It wasn't until an outside observer, a graduate student unaffiliated with the daily running of the experiment, expressed shock at the conditions that Zimbardo reconsidered what was happening. The study, originally planned for 2 weeks, was abruptly terminated after only 6 days. The Stanford prison experiment is often cited as a powerful illustration of the power of situational forces and social roles to override individual personality and moral judgment. It supports the idea that under certain conditions, ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts, both cruel and submissive, if the environment strongly reinforces those behaviors. The findings echoed earlier concerns raised during the post-World War II era about obedience and authority, similar to the insights gained from Stanley Milgram's obedience studies. However, the experiment has also been the subject of intense ethical and methodological criticism. Critics argue that the lack of proper safeguards, the dual role Zimbardo played, and the potential for demand characteristics, where participants act according to perceived expectations, compromised the scientific validity of the study. In later years, some participants claimed they had been encouraged to act a certain way, and new analyses have questioned how spontaneous the behavior actually was. Despite these controversies, the Stanford prison experiment continues to hold a significant place in discussions about human nature, ethics in research, and the psychological effects of institutional power. It challenges the assumption that only inherently bad people commit harmful acts and forces us to examine how systems, structures, and roles can shape behavior in profound and often troubling ways. Halo effect. The halo effect is a well-documented cognitive bias in which our overall impression of a person, company, brand, or product influences how we perceive their individual traits or qualities. It is a form of mental shortcut, an unconscious tendency to let one positive characteristic spill over and shape our judgments in unrelated areas. This effect was first named by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s after he observed that commanding officers tended to rate their soldiers consistently high or low across a range of attributes, such as intelligence, leadership, and physical appearance, based on a single positive or negative impression. If a soldier looked neat and confident, he was more likely to be seen as competent and smart, even if there was no evidence for those traits. A classic example of the halo effect in everyday life is how physical attractiveness can impact our judgment. Attractive individuals are often perceived as more intelligent, kinder, more capable, and even morally superior, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. This isn't necessarily conscious, rather, our brains unconsciously project a positive aura around them, coloring our perceptions. The halo effect doesn't just apply to people, it also affects how we evaluate brands, products, and public figures. For instance, if a tech company releases a widely successful product, people may begin to view all its offerings more favorably, even if some are mediocre. Or if a celebrity is known for their charity work, audiences may be more likely to excuse their personal flaws or scandals. This bias can have powerful consequences. In hiring, education, law, and leadership, the halo effect can lead to overestimating someone's competence or underestimating their faults, simply because of one standout trait. It can cloud judgment, create blind spots, and even reinforce systemic inequalities. Understanding the halo effect is essential because it reminds us how fragile and biased our perceptions can be. It urges us to critically question whether we're evaluating someone, or something, based on evidence, or merely on an unconscious glow cast by one appealing trait. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. In other words, the more often we are exposed to something, a person, a song, a brand, a face, or even a shape, the more we tend to like it, even if we don't consciously realize why. This effect was first formally studied by psychologist Robert Zajonc in the 1960s. Through a series of experiments, he demonstrated that repeated exposure to a stimulus increased participants' positive feelings toward it, even when the exposure was brief or subliminal. What's particularly intriguing is that this increase in preference can happen without any conscious awareness or logical reasoning. The object or person doesn't need to be remarkable or appealing at first glance. Familiarity alone breeds affection. The mere exposure effect plays a powerful role in many aspects of daily life. It explains why songs we initially found unremarkable become favorites after hearing them on the radio repeatedly, or why we might start to find a coworker more attractive over time, just by seeing them often. It's also why advertisers rely so heavily on repetition. By repeatedly exposing consumers to a logo, jingle, or slogan, brands become more likable and trustworthy, even if we don't have any direct experience with their products. This psychological tendency likely has evolutionary roots. From a survival standpoint, familiarity often equates to safety. In an uncertain world, unfamiliar things may signal risk, while repeated exposure can indicate a lack of threat. Over time, this ingrained comfort with the known has translated into a preference for it. However, the mere exposure effect also has limits. If initial exposure to something is strongly negative, if it evokes fear, disgust, or trauma, then repeated exposure may reinforce aversion rather than reduce it. Moreover, if exposure becomes excessive, it can lead to boredom or irritation, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as overexposure. Nonetheless, the mere exposure effect reveals how subtly our emotions and decisions can be influenced by the simple fact of repetition. It reminds us that our preferences are not always based on rational evaluation, but often emerge from unconscious, automatic processes shaped by familiarity alone. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the psychological capacity to recognize and understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, desires, emotions, and perspectives that are different from one's own. It is a fundamental aspect of human social cognition, allowing individuals to interpret, predict, and respond appropriately to the behavior of others. At its core, theory of mind enables people to attribute mental states not just to themselves but to others, forming the basis for empathy, cooperation, deception, communication, and moral reasoning. This ability typically begins to emerge in early childhood. Around the age of 4, most children start to show clear evidence of understanding that others can hold false beliefs, beliefs that differ from reality and from what the child knows to be true. This developmental milestone marks a significant shift in cognitive awareness. the realization that minds do not merely mirror the external world, but instead interpret it through subjective experiences. For instance, a child with theory of mind can understand that another person might look for a toy where they last saw it, even if the child knows the toy has since been moved. The development of this capacity is not instantaneous, it evolves gradually through social interaction, language exposure, and observation of others. It allows children and adults alike to infer intentions behind actions, to recognize when someone is being sarcastic or sincere, and to navigate the subtle nuances of social life. When a person tells a story, offers advice, or makes a joke, they are relying on the assumption that the listener can understand the thoughts behind their words, an assumption rooted in theory of mind. This cognitive ability also plays a central role in complex emotional responses. Empathy, for instance, depends on being able to imagine how someone else is feeling and why. Without this, emotional exchanges become shallow or mechanical. Conversely, behaviors like manipulation or strategic deception also rely on theory of mind, because they require a person to anticipate how others will interpret situations or react to certain information. Theory of mind is not uniform across individuals. Some people have a more intuitive grasp of others' mental states, while others may struggle with this form of social reasoning. In conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, there is often a noticeable difficulty with theory of mind, which can lead to challenges in social communication and understanding others' intentions. However, these difficulties vary widely and can be supported through targeted interventions and learning. Neuroscientific research has identified specific brain regions associated with theory of mind, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex, temporoparietal junction, and posterior superior temporal sulcus. These areas are thought to be involved in processing social information and constructing models of other minds. This research has provided insight into how the brain supports one of the most uniquely human abilities, the capacity to mentally step into another person's experience. In everyday life, theory of mind is constantly at work, often without conscious awareness. It enables people to interpret a glance, detect a hidden motive, comfort a friend, or negotiate a complex social situation. Without it, relationships and communication would be shallow and mechanical, lacking the richness of mutual understanding. Ultimately, theory of mind is what allows us not only to coexist with others but to connect, collaborate, and care. It is the invisible bridge that links one mind to another.